Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fortnightly Tech Talk. Great to see you all in the room. Thanks for joining us this Friday, and we're really looking forward to going over a bunch of really interesting developments in the worlds of privacy, regulation, maybe even a bit of AI. Great to have Lizzie in her new chair because her cat's got her good chair.
I'm just
Hi,
going to show you
Lizzie.
guys. Hi, there's the cat. I could not bear to move him because he looked very peaceful. So I hope you don't mind. I'm sitting next to him instead.
And making a escape from Sydney, even though there's 0 cases today, back in Perth, Dan Stinton from Guardian Australia. Hi, Dan.
Hello, folks. I thought I'd be in Sydney actually, but anyway, you can't trust McGowan, so I've hightailed it home just in case I got stuck there.
Well done. So we're in all circuits. Pay respects to Indigenous owners around wherever we are. I'm on Gadigal land, and recognise this land and none of the land where any of us on was ever seated. And welcome everyone to turn their cameras on and use the chat and jump into this discussion. I thought we'd anchor the discussion. I know it was Privacy Week last week, or is it this week? We're in the middle of privacy or on the edges of. So we'll talk a lot about privacy today because I think it means different things to different people. But before we get there, the big global news this week, I think, was this decision by Facebook's Supreme Court, its appointed group of elders who are there to give it social license. And it passed down a ruling this week on the platform's decision to permanently ban Donald Trump after the assault on the Capitol. And the ruling, which Lizzie has actually read, so she's totally up on most of the people in the room, I think, is a very elegant attempt to sit on the fence, Lizzie.
Yeah, it did uphold the decision on the basis that the content that Donald Trump posted on the day of the Capitol riots was, I think they described it as severely in violation of their community standards or the rules for being on Facebook. But then it did also give Facebook a bit of a kick by saying that the penalty imposed was not something that was within, it wasn't anticipated within the rules at the time and therefore was inappropriate. So it's got a little bit of a sly comment basically criticising Facebook by saying that it shouldn't have pushed it onto the oversight board to have to point that out, that it's not going to greenlight the penalty of permanent removal of Donald Trump just because they're in that position when it wasn't anticipated by the rules as they were at the time. So it's obviously endorsing that the content was appropriately taken down, but not necessarily the lifetime ban penalty. I mean, I'm not really sure what the consequence of that is in any meaningful way because, Donald Trump set up his own social media platform, as people may have seen, which is just basically a blog where he
But it's a blog with tweets.
That it's true. Yeah. I mean, I don't see people flocking to it, but maybe I'm wrong. But, there's a whole question here as to what kind of political context this decision was made in. Obviously, it's an outgoing president in a context in which the incoming president, Joe Biden, of all the tech companies, Facebook is the one that he seems to dislike the most, or the administration does. His chief of staff is pretty open about that. So there's clearly an organisational need to please the current administration. And so you do sort of wonder whether these decisions to take down and give Donald Trump a lifetime ban, on what basis they're motivated. But, this is, people will say that this is the oversight board working, and I do really wonder, I suppose, what it might look like if the oversight board makes a decision that's in conflict with the duty Facebook has to its shareholders, for example, which is not the case in this decision, I don't think, in any meaningful way. So the bigger question I've got is from a legal perspective, or, I'm a lawyer, so I think about these things in legal terms. Yeah, the company owes duties to its shareholders to maximize value. And that's the primary obligation they have, not to respect the decisions of the oversight board and not to respect the rights of users beyond what is set out in law. And it's this whole idea of the oversight board is interesting because Mark Zuckerberg has talked about how Facebook is actually more like a government than a private corporation. And I think that is accurate. So it is so large and has such a finger in so many parts of our lives that in many ways it is like a government. But actually being kicked off it is not really the same thing. And you can't be, I don't think it would be appropriate to compel Facebook to provide people with access to its platform. So, you know, then having a decision-making body that supposedly sits above the board and its duties to shareholders, these things all become quite messy. And I suspect that over the course of the Biden administration, some of these things might be resolved by broader forces like antitrust rulings and the like, that might diminish the power of Facebook such that it doesn't hold that power anymore, and it's not forced to come up with ways to make that power look legitimate, which I think is what the Oversight Board does. So I'm not a total cynic, but I do think, and there are people on there that
Well, let's hold on the
that are good.
Oversight Board
Okay,
for a
sorry.
sec. They're almost like, your analysis is they're almost like the corporate social responsibility arm, and they're there to create a veneer. They haven't really got much say. And if push comes to shove, the legal responsibility to maximize profit is going to come first.
Well, I'd be very interested to see where those two are pitted against each other. And this is not an example of that. And Mark Zuckerberg has said that the company will comply, but I think the rubber will hit the road when it's actually a situation that costs them a lot. And maybe the Oversight Board will never have to make a decision like that. But to me, the talk of it being an authority that the company is subservient to is pretty thin. I think it's pretty, it's fragile, because I don't think that's the reality.
Dan, one of the things that I find interesting about this decision, but more general, is that Facebook is being assailed from both the left and the right, but almost for very different reasons. So there is the Biden administration's position that the business model is unsustainable and it's having a negative effect on American society, and was actually partly responsible for the Capitol riot. And on the right, you've got people like Josh Hawley putting out a book saying the problem's big tech, but for totally different reasons, that it's big tech's power to silence the likes of Donald Trump is the problem we're trying to solve. So it's interesting where this decision fits in as a lightning rod. It's kind of still ending up with a whole lot of people talking across each other rather than coming up with some consensus of what comes next. Don't know where that takes you.
There's a lot there, Pete. I think you could probably boil down conservatives' criticism of Facebook to its and social media in general is that it sort of impinges on free speech. And I think there's relatively little evidence in support of that, but that seems to be the relatively consistent theme, although I am encouraged that there's at least some consensus forming with regards to antitrust on both the left and the right, for different reasons. I mean, just picking up on what Lizzie mentioned earlier, the problem, I think the Oversight Board is a step in the right direction, by the way, but it doesn't really solve the fundamental problem, which is it's largely for good feels. I mean, there's no obligation really on Facebook to act on its recommendations, and I think, as you said, Lizzie, the rubber will hit the road when something which costs them money comes up. I'd also make the point that the other problem with Facebook is that it's dual class share structure. So it's one of the most undemocratic companies in the world, because not only is it a social media company, which is far more important than just for its economic value because of its importance to social discourse, but in addition to that, you don't even have the normal rights. Shareholders don't even have the normal rights that they do, that they would in any other company, including what to do with who sits on the board, because Mark Zuckerberg effectively has complete control with his dual class share structure. So I think there's a real fundamental problem here. I don't know what the answer is other than breakup and other than enhanced competition. I think that seems to be probably the single best remedy that I can think of, is that we need to remove Facebook being the dominant social media company around the world, so that there's at least multiple platforms where these things can take place. And then Mark Zuckerberg having a lot of power over just the Facebook platform, for example, and not the Instagram platform and not WhatsApp, I think is probably a step in the right direction. The only other thing I can think of is that there's some kind of regulatory oversight, and Lizzie, this is probably straying into your territory, where there's a mandated responsibility for Facebook to act on either an independent oversight board or the oversight board that's set up, and that who sits on that oversight board is somehow democratic. But as usual, I haven't thought this through. Do you have thoughts on that, Lizzie?
Do you think that could be like a Chapter 3 court, like the Supreme Court? I mean, that's one argument, right? We have a public court system. Maybe we need to have democratically accountable laws that are made around content moderation. I mean, this is the great difficulty. I think all of these problems really are quite intensely political problems, and any kind of content moderation questions are incredibly difficult to resolve because what might be true in one setting isn't true in another, and there's lots of examples. So like part of what I think about the oversight board is it's an attempt to imitate a court in a private setting when actually we have public courts that are available for that process. But part of the other problem is, like you described, that it's kind of an infrastructure that's privately owned, that's there for shareholder value, and it's doing a lot of functions that make up our public life, that are essential to our public life, which to be honest is not a me problem. I feel like it's more a Peter Lewis problem, because he's posed the alternative is perhaps public infrastructure, publicly funded infrastructure, like repurposing the ABC for these kinds of engagements. I would say that one example of where the rubber might hit the road is looking at the takedowns in relation to the media bargaining code. So, Nick Souza, who's the Australian who is on the oversight board, who I know from his previous involvement in Digital Rights Watch, I did see him at the time asking on Twitter whether this was a decision, because it's a takedown decision by Facebook, whether it could be something that's within the remit of the oversight board. Now, they've got a process for determining which complaints they ultimately opine upon, but that's a good example where that takedown decision en masse actually was about putting the interests of the company ahead of the interests of users. And I would be interested to see, whether that was, something that the oversight board would ultimately endorse. I mean, it's reversed now, so maybe that's the reason they won't entertain it. But it was an example that if it'd been if it'd been maintained, and in the event that we get to another conflict with Facebook, that might be one outcome. Whether the oversight board arguing for the reinstatement of news content might be something that Facebook has to follow. I mean, that's an example, but I can't. It's difficult to see that happening in the short term, although it is certainly possible.
It feels to me, Lizzie, that you should be putting a complaint to the oversight board on what's happened, just to see how this would play out. I'd love to see what the oversight board says on that.
Oh, I know. Well, I wonder what Nick is doing. I mean, he's the one who raised it, which I thought was an interesting insight, because I think a lot of people were really appalled by that. It's just such a terrible thing to have done. But I think because of the reinstatement, they may not have any more jurisdiction. But I wonder if they could make a retrospective decision. I mean, these are the kinds of things that in law, I know from professional experience, all these things are nutted out over, decades, and various documents that set out the rules of procedure. Whereas Facebook's like, quite bombastically, we're going to set up a court and we're just going to run it, and and our board is going to be subservient to it, which I think does highlight some of the naivety and I don't know, arrogance, hubris that comes with this kind of process, which gives people like me, cause for cynicism, I suppose.
The other thing that strikes me, though, is that the entire mission of trying to civilize a platform that's designed to fire people up is kind of, and we've said this before, that the business model sends online behavior to the edge of acceptability, and then you're expecting some form of self-moderation, even though that's against the business model. So the analogy I'd use is that you've opened up this public park, you're encouraging people to shout at each other and face off at each other, and that's what's going to make the park work, and that's the park you want to create. And then you've got, but then what is the line when the face off becomes hitting someone, and then what is the sanction, and who chooses what sanctions should be taken? So it seems like the other way of looking at this is it just shows that this platform is not sustainable as the infrastructure for civic life, and that politics shouldn't be played on Facebook because the model is going to break politics whenever it is. And that's where it opens up this talk of alternate public digital infrastructures.
What do you think about that, Pete? Like Sarah asked a question before in the chat about what would happen if Trump ran again, and Lucy's put an answer that perhaps no one who's running should be able to have a profile on Facebook. Like you can talk about it online, but that maybe you don't get to have a profile or a persona on some of these platforms. Like I can understand the utility in that
with
decision.
candidates, like you look at the way elections are run. There are rules around how elections are run. There's rules on electoral laws on how candidates need to conduct themselves in the real world. There's very prescriptive rules to the extent that how close to a voting booth someone can be handing you out a bit of paper to throw in the bin. That there's rules on how an ad is put together and how it's approved. If you're putting an ad in the real world, you've got to get it approved to go on TV by showing there's a factual base. Do candidates need to be registered? They need to prove their citizenship. They need to do all sorts of things. So, why don't, if you are going to be serious about building a piece of civic infrastructure, and I know that we'll bump up against each other probably, Lizzie, on the idea of in a civic network registering citizens. But if you don't have rules and norms on how you go about your civic life, then it is a free-for-all where you've got to have this board or oversight committee of oversighting chaos, and that doesn't seem to be sustainable to me.
Yeah, I mean, the other component of this, of course, is kind of moderating content. You know, we've talked before about the memo that was put out by a woman who was responsible for tackling disinformation and the like in countries outside of the United States, and how difficult that was in an electoral setting, and how critical that role was, and how under-resourced she felt. And that's one thing that I think is interesting about observing this political moment. Facebook spent a lot of time figuring out how to handle the last US election in a way that I don't think they spend anywhere near as much time figuring out how they might do that in other countries. And, that doesn't sit well with me. There's obviously some reasons that might be justifiable for that, but there's a lot of reasons that are pretty poor. And I think with that power comes responsibility. So maybe that's the kind of regulation you need, proper requirements for, content moderation and content moderation standards, if not prescribing what those actual, the substantive nature of it might be, the procedural aspects, having people in the jurisdiction speak the language, appointing people to be able to make these kinds of decisions rather than outsourcing it to, someone in their 20s who's living and working in California, which I think is pretty unacceptable.
Beyond the regulation and the enforcement of rules, I am really interested in norms on platforms. So LinkedIn has a certain vibe because people put on their professional self. I joke that Twitter has a vibe because everyone's doing it while they're sitting on the toilet. Wikis have a vibe. I assume that's the case.
I think it's just you.
No.
I'll never look at your tweets the same way again, Peter, by the way.
But there are norms, right? Facebook's, because it's so ubiquitous, I feel like norms haven't been created, although in some community groups, really committed moderators will build their own norms. And so a lot of the pushback on doing anything ambitious around public digital infrastructure, it's a cost of moderation. But it seems to me that if you build the norms in first and bake that into the system with red lines and guardrails that are clearly articulated, then things aren't quite as, it's not like every single person needs to be monitored by a moderator. Like that seems to be a failure of a system rather than a strength of a system.
I think it's three things, Peter. I think I heard this really interesting conversation this week actually with a lady called Michelle Gelfand on exactly this topic, on the development of norms and how they typically develop over decades, centuries, millennia in some cases, in some cultures. And the fundamental problem we've got with a lot of this digital infrastructure is it's just so new. And so, yes, there are different norms that exist on the LinkedIn platform and different consequences, by the way, for how you have discourse on LinkedIn versus because of it's linked to your actual profile and your career compared to what happens on Twitter or Facebook or anything else. But I think part of the problem is just these companies are so new, and this is just so new for us as a society that the norms haven't developed yet. I am starting to get a little bit encouraged. Maybe I'm naive. In fact, I suspect I am. But it feels, I have noticed a lot of people are less trying to do the sensational catch people out stuff that has happened on Twitter. I mean, it still happens there massively, obviously, but I have noticed a shift from some people who are trying to treat it a little bit more seriously. So hopefully that is the start of some kind of new norms forming where perhaps that platform will become less so. That's the first thing. I think norms need to develop. That's going to take time. The other thing, though, is touching on your other point, Peter, is that regulation hasn't caught up either. So you made the point about the rules around how you can hand out pamphlets at a polling booth and whatever else. And there's also the 48-hour blackout period on advertising before an election. That doesn't exist on digital, right? So I mean, I've worked in news publishers for most of my career. We loved the 48 hours before an election because all of the money that was being spent on newspaper and TV ads all of a sudden flowed into digital. And so you had this massive bonanza of advertising that came in the last 48 hours. And in some cases, the audiences on the digital platforms in lead up to the election were bigger than, or in fact, in almost every case, were bigger than the newspaper audiences or the TV audiences anyway. So again, it just demonstrates the point that regulation hasn't caught up because this is so new. The third point is, again, Lizzie's mentioned it today and I've said it 100 times. So I'll just, in summary, take moderation seriously, have moderators in every country that you operate in. Context matters. It should be a cost of production that is not factored into any of these companies' business models. And the bigger your audience, the bigger your moderators should be. And it needs to literally be in the millions, I think, in the case of Facebook, if they're going to keep it the same size that they are.
Yeah. A couple of other interesting legal cases that I think from the States, but Snapchat being sued for the impact on one of its tools in a fatal car accident. Lizzie.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I speak as somebody who's not actually a Snapchatter. There may be Snapchatters in the audience who can comment more definitively on this, but there is a tool in Snapchat that was available whereby you could it would indicate how fast you were traveling. And so there's a suit being brought by the parents of a young boy who was using this function when he was in a speeding vehicle. And their argument is that this is an example of incitement to do dangerous things, which ultimately cost this kid his life, because that is what it did. It meant that people traveled really fast in cars and put their speed on Snapchat. And so the question is about also the fact that these platforms are treated as publishers, so not liable for the content that people post on them.
This is the section 230 from the site.
Yep, which is kind of controversial, but that's not actually about the product design itself, which might encourage dangerous behavior, rather than actually the content that's being posted by a user being the source of that harm. And so I think this is interesting because there are a lot of features of these products that are potentially quite dangerous. There's a lot of things that, for example, look like gambling to me. In some of the games that people play, you can sort of end up kind of gambling on, even if it's not with a particular kind of currency, which could potentially, or, statistically, there's a high chance in some circumstances of that leading to addiction. And I do wonder to what extent you could then say that's a problem with product design, and it's something that the company should have foreseen and had put in place protections for vulnerable users. I think there's a real question there. I'm not convinced this case is going to go well, but yeah, it's worth thinking about quite carefully. And I think if I was a product designer in a company, I would be starting to think about how, features when used as intended can still cause harm. This is not just an example of a platform being used in a way that was unintended by the designers. And there are a lot of instances where I think this could happen, and it could be the new shift in law for holding these companies accountable, not for, the capital right, for example, which, people claim is because of Facebook or Clubhouse or any of these other platforms facilitating that kind of organising, but because the whole design of the platform does things that are harmful in and of itself.
So could the same theory, and I take it you say this is a personal injury lawyer in the States on having a crack. So yeah, take that.
I am a fan of plaintiff lawyers, but they do like to have cracks.
Yeah. Could you see the same principle, say, on a dating app?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think it is that you've got to draw a distinction between what the app is trying to do. So it's I don't spend enough time on dating apps to be able to give an explanation of an example of kind of dangerous behavior that might give rise as a result. But this is, I think, the problem with the speeding one as well, because ultimately someone's made a decision to speed. And the question is, to what extent is the platform responsible for that? Or to what extent do they assume the risk associated with that behavior themselves? And so in a dating app scenario where you might go on a date with someone who ends up harming you, then that may be pretty hard to distinguish because that person has engaged in behavior that's criminal that could never have been anticipated. They're not doing it because of the app. But say you ended up having an eating disorder because you go on Instagram every day and all you see is influencers who have manipulative photos selling you, you know, juice cleansers. There's an argument that that kind of design where it feeds you the same thing again and again, and it's difficult to break out of that cycle, could give rise to harm or, you know, some kind of long-term mental illness. That's possible. I mean, I think it is speculative and there'll be lots of ways in which they try to resist that. But I can also understand how the design of the product there is giving rise to a risk of harm for vulnerable people. So what is the company doing to limit that? Like putting a, you know, filter in a cigarette, or that's a bad example because the cigarette's still dangerous, but, you know, like mitigating the harm, even if the product is inherently harmful, I suppose.
Or Dan, maybe someone suing the Guardian for making them too earnest. Like, you know.
Well, there would be an awful lot of
that'd be a class action. That'd be a class action.
Although I see, I mean, Dylan, who I normally spar with, made a good point. I mean, and that is that we don't typically damage or assume that car makers are responsible for people who speed. So I guess at what point is it the individual's responsibility versus the platform's responsibility?
But if their bags don't work, then we're off to the courts.
What's that, sorry?
If the speed bag doesn't work, though, then we're off to court.
Yeah, totally. And look, I think you can also look at this, and again, I think we touched on this previously, but where Section 230 falls down, or at least needs reform, is with regards to content, is amplification of that content. And the algorithms that are responsible for amplifying content is really the part where these where these tech companies need to be held responsible. It's not product design, Lizzie, it's obviously a bit more narrow than that, but I think perhaps starting in a more narrow definition or a more narrow reform of 230, where you say, okay, Facebook, if you amplify something which is going to result in a storming of the Capitol, for example, which is absolutely what happened, then you are criminally responsible for that, or responsible for that more broadly, and there needs to be some consequences to that. I think thinking through that, I mean, it's a hugely complicated area, but I think it has to be better than just a blanket excuse to do absolutely nothing and have no accountability.
So I was just going to bring you go, Liz. I'm just going to bring Nicola up because she had a good point in there too.
Well, I just say I agree with you about the cars, right? Of course, if you make a car go really fast, you can't hold the car manufacturer responsible because they allow the car to go fast. It's up to you as the driver to be responsible for that. But I'll just give you one kind of nerdy law story, which is there's a great case from Australia about product liability where the product did exactly what is intended, but it still caused harm. And it's about Leo Beering. So Leo Beering used to make this bottle of sparkling wine.
Libfra wine.
Yeah. And so what you do is you take off the metal cap, and then about 3 seconds later, the cork would pop out. And there's this gorgeous little case where they talk about the plaintiff being someone who wasn't really accustomed to drinking, you know, even though thousands and thousands of these bottles have been consumed. So it was a novelty everyone knew about. And so he unscrewed, I think it was New Year's Eve. He unscrews the cap for his, you know, once a year drink. And he goes to pour it, nothing comes out. So he goes to take a look down the neck of the bottle and it shoots him in the face and gives him soft tissue damage. And it's an example of like, that is what the product was supposed to do, but it still harmed him. Anyway, the outcome was that there's warnings on the bottle. They eventually got rid of it. But you know, you should have to tell people. You can't just assume because everyone knows this or it's widely consumed that everybody will be able to use the product correctly.
Another little ticker box on the
platform. I mean, maybe that's part of it, but offering warnings, putting in guardrails for people who might be vulnerable or not accustomed to using your product so that they stop causing themselves harm when using the product as intended, that's not an unreasonable requirement. And it's I guess I'm just trying to draw the distinction between knowing that a product is capable of being dangerous, of which a car is, of which a knife is, of which a gun is, for example, but making sure it's still designed in a way that can protect people from unintended harm if they're not familiar with using it correctly or appropriately, I think is not an unreasonable requirement on manufacturers of products, including digital products.
Hi, Nicola. You just had a bit of a comment about the product design, you know, decision matrix. Do you want to just share that with the crowd?
Well, so I work in IT, and in the more aware circles, we're starting to talk about ethical design practices. And, you know, this is not just how could someone use a dating app in order to stalk women, kind of, which would be inappropriate use of the product, but also the law of unintended consequences. And so this is, you know, that whole, I'm using it exactly as designed and I still managed to shoot myself in the foot. And today we're not very good about thinking about those unintended consequences. We're getting better at starting to think about marginalised communities, and a big driver for getting that happening is having a more diverse team who are developing these things, who have got experience in these other areas. But thinking about ways in which it could unexpectedly, harm someone who is using it totally appropriately is not something that I think that we're catching up with. And expecting, it comes again down to that whole expecting the consumer to have the full set of awareness is really hard. And so putting the onus back on the people who presumably have got the most expertise in this product, the manufacturers, seems the right way to go around it. I just wish that it didn't have to require someone injuring themselves and a lawsuit in order to produce this. I wish it was, more of a standard that, we could get companies thinking about up front a little bit more.
Yeah,
I mean, because I'm a lawyer, I like to think these kinds of lawsuits do encourage that kind of behaviour.
It is currently a very fast way to generate change, but I think consumer awareness, we put a lot of stuff onto the consumer, and they don't, individuals don't really love bringing lawsuits unless, you're from America.
Can I make an observation that may be obvious, and just because I'm not across the detail and want to take a step back, so I have something to say. I think this speaks to the problem with digital platforms is the culture around move fast and break things, which is obviously associated with Facebook, but it's putting out a minimum viable product and allowing your audience to be the testers in real life is the fundamental problem here. I think the reason why we have so many problems with digital products compared with physical products.
Yeah, users are the crash test dummy.
Totally. I mean, it's you put a car out into the world and let's go, okay, we're going to let the millions of people driving the Toyota determine whether the airbags work or the wheels are screwed on properly and whatever else is just a ludicrous concept. But that's exactly what we do with digital products, right?
That's still a second order thing. The reason that they go for move fast and break things is because everybody drastically underestimates how expensive it is to build software. We have a perception that because you can change it at any time, because it's not a physical process, that it is A, fast, B, flexible, and relatively cheap to make. We've got all these very expensive technical experts around. Turns out that it's slow, it's expensive, and then we've run out of money, we've run out of runway. So we are going to have to experiment on our users, and we are prepared to accept the risk that maybe there's going to be an accident and we're going to have to recompense that, but it's cheaper than spending the time and losing the hype to build it properly. And this is correlated with the fact that users aren't, like consumers at an end user level, aren't really used to spending money for software.
Yeah. I used to do this.
Has taught us to expect things for free.
Sorry, you go.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think the antidote to this really is standards. Like it's not that everybody's required to comply with, so the consumer has an expectation they'll have to pay for it, as in the purchaser of software products in whatever form that may be. And also designers are given the space to do this work without having to rush to ship their product. I mean, I have this chapter in my book where I talk about this, and I talk about the Ford Pinto as an example, which everybody learns about in law school, which is a car that had a vulnerability that if you bumped it from behind, it had a tendency to catch fire. And the decision was to not include a plastic buffer that would have cost $1.25 to stop that, because they were rushing to get the car to market. It just sounds exactly the same. And so the way that was kind of resolved was a scandal, because thousands of people died a fiery death, and the company was sued by many plaintiff lawyers. But also then you end up having vehicle safety standards. You have a bureau that's invested with that responsibility that actually did their job. You have, lots of nationalized services associated with testing. Like you build up the infrastructure of making the product safe. It's not just left to the company to change its culture. It's not just left to the consumer to pay more when they're not going to be rewarded for that when they're buying these kinds of software products to do more testing. That actually the playing field is leveled in the marketplace by setting baseline standards and then backing that up by governments having the resources devoted to monitoring and making people accountable when they fall short of those standards. I think that's the other thing that's kind of missing in our current society.
John's got a great question here, which is, has there been litigation relating to the design or use of algorithms? And I don't know if you've got an off the top, but it speaks to the US Senate hearings over the last couple of weeks as well, where they were trying to say, well, what is the model for making companies responsible for the algorithms that they put forward?
Well, the answer, of course, is yes. I mean, I have two examples come to mind that might be compelling. I don't know. But there was a criminal law setting where in New York, the legal aid lawyers, to get their client a proper defense, had to reverse engineer a process that was used to collect DNA, because collecting DNA is actually more complex than you might think, because people shed DNA all the time at different rates. So presence of DNA on a crime scene might not necessarily mean the person was there. Anyway, the government was, the prosecutorial team were using an algorithm to determine presence of DNA, and it was very compelling to a jury because DNA is very compelling. But the legal aid team reverse engineered it and found that the presence of DNA was in fact very low, and the client was able to, advance those arguments and the like. So there's some litigation which involved, I think, in a terrible way, government use of, essentially, prosecutorial teams' use of an algorithm that was inherently unjust, that required people to agitate and change it. The other one that comes to mind closer to home is, of course, robo-debt, which is a class action that's just being in the process of being settled. But that's an algorithm, and the plaintiff in that case accused the government of unjust enrichment by taking debts that it wasn't entitled to because of the function of the algorithm. So, I mean, is that the use of an algorithm? Is that a litigation about an algorithm? I would say it is, because what it's produced is a bunch of results that are unfair, and then it requires somebody to litigate to reverse the decision, which is unfortunate. But that is the timing of it, and that's how we get accountability around these things, I think, rather than. Yeah, sorry.
The other interest, and the robo-debt was one of the inspirations for the Human Rights Commission looking at discrimination within the digital infrastructure. And Ed Santo's report, which is sitting on the AG's desk, I understand, which is calling for a bunch of things, including discoverability of algorithms where to prove that they're not breaching discrimination principles, and also a pause on facial recognition technology, which again opens up yet another can of worms. But also, Dan, in your work in the media space, that whole transparency of algorithms is really important as well, and that's been one of the key battlegrounds with the platforms in terms of thinking through how traditional media can work with social media.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, again, this speaks to concentration of power, which I guess we always come back to, but for good reasons. But particularly in the case of Google and Facebook, I guess secondary, but Google mainly. I mean, Google's algorithm to a large extent powers the digital economy, and yet it is completely opaque. And the justification that Google have said for keeping it completely opaque is that if they were to reveal the secret source, then people would be able to game the algorithm, and that would be unfair. And I'm sure that that's true, by the way. I just don't think that the argument holds anymore, though, when where people go online is largely determined by Google's algorithm, and therefore their algorithm makes or breaks businesses, and changes to that algorithm can make or break businesses. In the case of media organisations, that's also the case with Facebook. And we saw this, I think, about 3 years ago when Facebook changed their algorithm to downweight the importance of news publishers within the Facebook newsfeed. And as a consequence of that, some publishers saw their traffic drop by more than half. I think we need to have, when there's a certain threshold where companies get to, and I guess this is what the News Media Bargaining Code was getting to with regards to designation, at some point, these platforms get to a sufficient size where they are absolutely controlling where people go online. And with that power comes tremendous responsibility. Sorry to quote Spider-Man or whatever it is, but I think that there just needs to be more transparency about this. The one unfortunate circumstance that we have following the News Media Bargaining Code is that because at this stage, Google and Facebook have not been designated, there isn't actually an obligation on them to provide notification of their algorithm to news publishers or anybody else. I think we need it. And as I've said many times before, I don't think this is something, I think it was a legitimate argument for people to say that news publishers were going to be able to get an unfair advantage from having advance notice of algorithm changes. I think that's fair. I just think Google should give advance notice of algorithm changes to everybody, not just to news publishers, because I think their algorithms power where people go online.
Hey, let's move on to privacy, given that we spent 40 minutes on our first agenda item. Fantastic discussion, and thanks particularly, Nicola. So Privacy Week, we've just held it. Digital Rights Watch did a walking tour of Melbourne. One of my great regrets in not being at Melbourne and not having been there for 18 months was not coming along. But do you want to, and I don't know if Lucy's there as well, what did you do? Like, what happened on a walking tour? I know I said, can you show me photos? And you said we don't really have any, but give us the audio walking tour.
Well, I wanted to tell you guys that if you wanted to do it yourself and you're in Melbourne, we've got a microsite up which has the content on there, and you can do a self-guided walking tour. So I think, I mean, Lucy, you might be finding Lucy to unmute her, but
I'm
Lucy
really trying
will
hard.
also
She might have
said
gone
she would
out
post
for
the
a
microsite,
sandwich.
which I will do in a moment. But essentially what the idea of the walking tour was to highlight some of the programs that are put in place by the City of Melbourne around safe cities, so the use of cameras and how many there are, to talk about when that kind of program came about, particularly around the crimes that took place in the Bourke Street Mall, and the response, the way in which tech policy often, or tech programs often advance in response to a crisis. So talking about that, and then as well as like public surveillance programs, we talked a bit about private surveillance programs, about how if you're thinking about a space that you might go into where you're most likely to be surveilled, it's probably actually the shopping mall, and that's probably the most intensely surveilled you'll be during your day, and how companies have an intense interest in following you around using cameras, using Wi-Fi connections, using number plate readers, so they can work out exactly how you've moved through a shopping mall, and it's a so they can learn about it. But it's a kind of different idea of privacy compared to, say, state or law enforcement use of cameras to be able to detect people because they want to know who that is. They want to identify someone with their name and address if they want to prosecute an offence against them. But compare that to kind of private surveillance, which doesn't really care about your name and address, but you as a part of a cohort, as a curated audience for advertising and the like, and helping people, I guess, come to terms with those different ideas of privacy.
So there'd be examples where that'd be okay, like if it's for a traffic flow. Are we cool with like?
Yeah, there's some really snazzy looking cameras, I have to say, in Melbourne that monitor traffic flow.
Yeah.
And of course, there may be really good reasons for high-tech devices in our cities, and the City of Melbourne has some of them in place, like smart bins, like bench sensors and the like.
What's
so
a
that we
smart
can
bin do?
It's it gives it's a great conversationalist. No, I'm joking. It detects when it's full, and then you can come and pick it up. So
It talks
that's
trash.
Sorry, that's a
Yeah.
terrible dad joke.
I know. Go on.
Mother's Day, not
but
Father's
so-
Day this weekend.
Yeah, yeah.
But the idea, of course, is that some of this tech is really great. It doesn't have to be surveillance based. One of the conclusions we're trying to draw is that the UN does have a program on smart cities, and cities can sign up to this. They set baseline requirements, things like making sure that you have public consultation, making sure you give citizens information about what kinds of programs exist and the use of that kind of technology, and that we think this would be a step forward if cities around Australia signed up to it. So it's not being an anti-tech person in the context of city and urban design. It's more about saying, well, let's not build the capacity for intense surveillance. It might be just cameras now, but eventually that could be real-time facial recognition. And, let's think about the consequences of the infrastructure we're building into our cities and make sure that we're protecting rights as well as giving huge amounts of information to people who might need it that come about as a result of that infrastructure.
I'm going to call my good friend Simon Carter up, who's been doing great work in this space with the Sustainable Digitalisation Project. Are you there, Simon?
Sure am.
So, I'm sure that Melbourne's not the only city where we could do this, but what's the thinking, to Lizzie's point, around thinking through what actual infrastructure we're building here?
Oh, look, we're really concerned about that. Had a very interesting conversation yesterday with an investor, a European company, about 140 billion pounds of assets under management. And they've just done a groundbreaking piece of research around facial recognition and the implications of that. And obviously for them, ultimately, it feeds back to investment risk. But it's an excellent paper. I'll post it in the chat in a minute. Basically, they point out that the space is just out of control, and ultimately one of the fundamental issues is consent, and there is no consent to this. And in the worst case, you have Clearview AI and offering cheap deals to individual police officers outside of the governance of their police departments to use their facial recognition services and go and pull people off the streets with all of the different issues associated with that, racial biases and a lot of inaccuracy, etc. So, you know, there's certain places in the world where it has been banned or moratoriums on it. San Francisco, interestingly, is one city, and Belgium is a nation. And even in this conversation yesterday, you pointed to some of the big tech firms have effectively put moratoriums on their offerings. So the bottom line is there's some really, really big questions around the use of surveillance technology in the built environment, and increasing voices such as out of the investment community now to pause and think carefully about what we're building.
Just going back a step, I forget how big that number was, but it was making my eyes water. What are they investing in terms of facial recognition technology? What are they trying to do with that investment?
Oh, that's their whole portfolio, 140 billion. They're not just
yeah, right. That would be a lot of cameras.
Facial recognition, but for them, the whole thing stemmed from they invested in a technology company and then found that there were questions around what was happening with the use of facial recognition technology, and they paused and thought very carefully about it. But the broader investment community, and this is more of a responsible investment house, it's at the pointy end, leading the pack. The mainstream investment community, where there's sort of the tens and tens of trillions of dollars invested, isn't yet focusing on it. But we are at the beginning of a shift where it's now on the investor agenda.
Thanks, Simon. You're breaking up a bit, so we might not keep going there. But that ban on facial recognition technology that has been brought in San Francisco, that is one of the recommendations that will be coming through the Human Rights Commission. It's also, you know, you can see a world, I think, where, you know, as we used to have nuclear-free zones in our suburbs and our cities, it would be great to think that we could build a consciousness around these issues so that individual communities could speak up. There was, Lizzie, that celebrated battle in Toronto against Google creating an entirely connected city. So there are examples of people saying we don't want this and doing something about it.
Yeah, there's plenty of examples. The Toronto City experiment is one of them, where Google was planning on building a waterfront development that was full of sensors, and it sounded like a nightmare to me. But you know, it was supposed to be very futuristic, and everyone would be tracked at all times, and that would be fed back into the public infrastructure. But yeah, there's a couple of cities in California that have banned facial recognition in their boundaries. There's also, obviously, in the people may know, I shouldn't say obviously, but in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, both Microsoft and Amazon stopped selling facial recognition technology to law enforcement. And that, I think, is a step forward. And I think that, you know, regulators should not be on the back foot about this and be lagging behind private companies. I think Clearview AI is a really good example, actually, because people often talk about, you know, sharing things with Facebook and government, assuming that those different relationships are distinct. But it's an example there of Clearview AI scraping all the photos from Facebook and then using that to build a facial recognition tool, which was then used by police officers, and including in Australia, the AFP have used it, and how, you know, that's really awful. Like, that's essentially arguably an unlawful.
It was awful, and it wasn't successful either. Like, most of the matches were wrong.
Well, I mean, this is the question about facial recognition. Do you want it to work, or are you worried that it doesn't work? And I think probably both of them are true at the moment. But, you know, there's a Human Rights Watch has a report on facial recognition technology where they talk about how police saw footage of a robbery in a bodega. They put the image of the offender through the facial recognition database, got no one, but they thought that the person looked like Woody Harrelson. So then they put an image of Woody Harrelson through the algorithm and found some matches and arrested someone
for looking like Woody Harrelson.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think it's a joke, but, like, you know, and so this kind of thing, it's not that. Well, look, I mean, I was going to say something generous about police there, but what I was going to say was you need to put in place really clear rules, because people don't know how to use it, and even if it worked well, I'm not sure that's a good thing. So we shouldn't be relying on, you know, law enforcement using these tools responsibly, because I think there's plenty of historical examples of that not being the case. So maybe we need to stop building it if it can't be done well. And if it can be done well, the consequences could be pretty dire. So maybe we should stop building it anyway. That's the kind of conversation I'd like to have, rather than surreptitiously police end up using this and using it in appalling ways. And you know, that disproportionately affects people that they tend to over police, and that tends to be minorities. So yeah. I'll stop.
Lucy wanted to jump in. I'm sure Dan's got something to say about this too.
Oh yeah,
hey, Lucy.
thank you.
You're ensuring that your face won't be recognised.
Not even by us.
Sorry guys, yeah, I'm feeling a little under the weather, so I don't think it would be very flattering camera view. I apologize. Yeah, I mean, Lizzie already covered a lot of what I would say. I guess the other thing that I like to bring up is in the US intelligence community, there's a term for, you know, love intelligence, and it's actually a term, it's a coined term because so often you know, this sort of technology gets used and abused for people to like spy and surveil on their romantic partners, friends' romantic partners, and like further it perpetuates domestic violence and a lot of like sort of terrible things. And it's so prevalent that there's an actual term in the intelligence community for it, and I find that incredibly frightening. But the conversation that we wanted to start with, sort of the surveillance city, just to go back to that, is just that it's sort of a runaway train in terms of technology. And we just wanted to get people in Melbourne to start thinking about why certain cameras are there and whether we're having a think about that. And what Lizzie just brought up, that sort of moment of where Clearview AI took data from Facebook, you know, and used it to build a system that served government. A lot of the times when we talk about law enforcement access to data that's held by private companies, you know, I kind of use the hyperbole of, well, if the government wanted to build their own Facebook, like if the government built Facebook and invited you all on it, I don't think anyone would like voluntarily start uploading pictures and tagging friends in it and sort of uploading their favorite quotes and like musicians. It would have an entirely different connotation and feel, and just, you know, you would
That's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's
It's
you don't
different.
think that's a bad thing?
No, I'm saying that's a different thing. Going back to government funding public digital infrastructure, for instance.
There's a difference between government funding and government running.
owning. Yeah, you know, I get that.
But it's, you know, and it's an interesting, I think a lot of digital rights issues kind of get sunk in this like public-private partnership that happens. Like a lot of the times governments do that deliberately to hide certain technologies they're using. So they kind of outsource the questionable responsibilities off to like a private company or a series or a sequence of them. And then it's really hard for us to chase down, like, you know, the fact that the Australian government uses Celebrite wasn't like a well-known fact. That kind of was a, you know, that was a contractual relationship that we learned about by happenstance.
Dan, any reflections?
I think it's interesting. A government-run social network could just be Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison talking to each other. I think I don't know if it's going to have much more widespread community appeal
Donald
than
Trump's
that. But
blog. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. I think we've got a preview of it. It's basically Donald Trump's blog. Maybe that's what it would look like. Look, I'm not an expert on this sort of camera technology, but I do think it's interesting what I think you mentioned, Simon, and just the lack of consent that comes with this and the parallels that this draws with the online world, and the fact that there is virtually no consent and really no possible way of gaining consent around the collection of a lot of the data that is collected by all these companies. I think whether it's in the offline world or the online world, I haven't thought this through, so I'll throw it out there and see if it's
it's good.
sounds silly.
It's good.
Probably
Go
will.
with it. Yeah.
Perfect forum for it. But I just think the problem with consent-based consent is that it's even online, and this is the problem with GDPR. It's hard to understand what you're consenting to, and I just think a better solution, both in the offline world and the online world, is that you just outlaw certain collection of data. So I think this is kind of what you touched on, Lizzie. I think having places where facial recognition technology is just banned, I think is that kind of approach also needs to be applied to the collection and use of some consumer data online, rather than saying you need to have consent for it. You just should outlaw it. And I think that probably goes a long way to solving a lot of the problems that exist in the online world. That said, I do applaud Apple with their changes that have been rolled out with iOS 14.5 and the app tracking technology, and basically asking consent for that, because I think it's a circumstance where it's relatively clear. It's like you're asking the consumer, do you give Facebook or any other app for that matter the consent to track you across other apps? It's pretty easy to understand, and because it's pretty easy to understand, as I understand it, about 90% of Australians are saying no. I think that demonstrates the point of where consent can be useful and where it just is too burdensome.
Thanks a lot for that. Any last thoughts, Lizzie, before we put a pin in it?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the example that comes to mind in terms of international law is that there are red lines that exist for technologies and conduct in international law that still go on, but are considered a breach as of right, I suppose. And that are things like torture or the use of chemical weapons. These things, it is capable to say, we are capable of saying this technology might be effective in what it does. Chemical weapons are very effective, but we're not going to use them. And I like to think that's the kind of approach we'd take, not because it's not always complied with, because we know that it's not, but it does set baseline standards that we expect from each other and from companies. And, that kind of norm building activity is essential to a functioning system of law, just as much as respect for all of the letter of the law. So I think there is some work we could do and examples we can draw from about how we might be able to say about facial recognition, for example, that we shouldn't use it at all. And not, with the knowledge some people might, but as a baseline expectation, it shouldn't be able to be used, including in things like the exercise of public powers, like prosecutorial ones.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Nicola, Simon, Lucy, and everyone else that was jumping in. Always a great conversation, always interesting to chart what we all, how we all come at this from different directions, and also tap the vast gaps in knowledge that everyone brings to this fast evolving world. But thanks, everyone. We're working out what platform we're going to continue to be having these discussions on, but for now we'll be saying see you in a fortnight's time, and thanks for being part of today. Thanks, guys.